This is a little update. I gave you a first update on my first video this morning, a few minutes ago, talking about the Grazer and stupid fucking oil workers boot evidence they found, while ignoring talking about Baltic operations 2022. I told you about that stupid shit. Well, I'm going to tell you about a little update to the Nova Kakhovka dam bombing story that's developed yesterday. It happened yesterday. And I took a look at it this morning. And I believe that there's some similarities, enough similarities to wonder if it was done by a naval underwater UUV or underwater unmanned underwater vehicle. Much like what happened, I think, with Nord Stream 2. There's an update I want to share with you. An update brought to us by Uncle Hotep. Giving Uncle Hotep some credit here. But let's take a look at the news. Oh my goodness, the news. It's all about what fucking Zelensky said Russia blew up. Ukraine accuses Russian forces of blowing up their major dam. BBC says what we know about the Nova Kakhovka dam attack. The Guardian, I've shown you that article this morning, with Kiev accuses Russia of blowing it up. And then, of course, Reuters. Reuters has a fact box, and they talk about the dam and the explosion and what happened. Of course, their fact box points a finger at Putin. Here's some perspectives for you, gathered together by Google. All of the perspectives blame Putin for blowing up the dam. All of them. The ones that they're sharing with you here, at least. The Russia blowing up of the Nova Kakhovka dam means the war in Ukraine has entered a new phase. Somebody else said Russia blowing up the Kakhovka NPP is an act of terrorism that will have long-lasting negative effects not just on Ukraine but the whole world. So they're going to make your economy scream a bit more because the dam was blown up. And of course, Zelensky UA on his Twitter account writes, Russia's been controlling the dam, the entire Kakhovka HPP for more than a year. It's physically impossible to blow it up somehow from the outside by shelling. It was manned by Russian occupiers, so their suggestion is for some reason the Russians decided to blow up the dam that they took. One of the first things they did was take control of the dam so that they couldn't turn off the tap water to the people in fucking Crimea. And they've held it ever since. Well, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, all of that blaming Putin, blaming Russia. Oh my God, the evil commies did it. You know who did it before? Zelensky. Ukraine. As Russia pointed out, they have shelled it before, but they also hit it with a HIMARS. Our HIMARS. And they did that in September of last year. And they did that as a test to see if they could puncture a hole through the fucking sluice gate, or one of the sluice gates on it, and take it out. And it was successful. And the Russians fixed it. And the reason they didn't take them all out at once and totally flood the area was it would be catastrophic. And the Ukrainian in charge of making that decision said, we just aren't at that point yet. We're not quite that desperate. And that happened in September of last year. And do you know who reported on it? The Washington Post. Washington Post? Washington Post. The Washington Post reported on that, and it's behind a paywall. You can't see it. However, the Wayback Machine isn't behind a paywall. Credit where credit is due. Uncle Hotep brought this to our attention. Thank you, Uncle Hotep. If you do not follow Uncle Hotep at Uncle Hotep, I don't know why. This is the screenshot taken from the article. And in it, it points out something very interesting. Kovalchuk considered flooding the river. The Ukrainians, he said, even conducted a test strike with a HIMARS launcher on one of the floodgates of the Nova Kakhovka of the Nova Kakhovka dam, making 3 holes in the metal it used to see if the Dnieper waters could be raised enough to stymie Russian crossing, but not flooding nearby villages. The test was a success, Kovalchuk said, but the step remained a last resort, so he held off. Who protected the dam? Who took it first as soon as they made entrance into the country so they could protect it? And who punched holes in it? It wasn't the Ukrainians protecting it from the Russians punching holes in it. It was, in fact, the Russians protecting it from the Ukrainians punching holes in it. And they could have taken it out completely with the HIMARS system. Or maybe a AUV or UUV. They could have taken it out completely, but they didn't because they weren't quite that desperate at the time. This article is behind a paywall. I don't make that Uncle Hotep type money, so I'm not on fucking WaPo. New York Times is about as much as I can do. This is a long article talking about the fucking all these different developments in the Ukrainian counteroffensive and the war that was going on. It was published in December of 2022 by the Washington Post. Written by Isabel Karshudian. Isabel Karshudian. She Kurdish? I don't know. There's a lot of stuff in this article about the war and how the war developed and how the war was developing at that time. And the fact that they had serious problems, especially down south. But then in this part 6, I think, is of this massive long article, they come to discuss this area, the Kherson offensive, and what was happening then. I'm going to read all of this to you because I don't want it to be said that I left anything out to deliberately mislead the people watching this. And of course, my reading glasses are in the other room. Outstanding. But I want you to pay close attention. People are going, oh my God, Putin is so evil. How could Putin even conceive of taking out a fucking dam just to make a little bit of fucking headway on the goddamn conflict? Quote, the American and the British war gamers ran their own simulations using the same inputs but different software and analysis, and they couldn't get the operation to work. Given the number of Ukrainian troops and available stockpiles of ammunition, the planners concluded that the Ukrainians would exhaust their combat power before achieving the offensive's objectives. Quote, this was them asking for our advice, said a U.S. senior defense official, who, like others in this article, spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive military planning. And our advice was, hey guys, you're going to bite off more than you can chew. This isn't going to work out well. End quote. Beyond the risk of running out of steam, a Zaporizhia offensive might have pushed Ukrainian forces into a pocket the Russians could surround with reinforcements sent along from two axes from Crimea and Russia. Our commanders thought the Ukrainians left pretty determined that they were going to do the whole thing anyway, just that there was a lot of pressure to do this whole thing, the defense official said. The White House reiterated the U.S. military's analysis in talks with Zelensky's office. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan talked to the Ukrainian president's chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, about the plans for a broad southern counteroffensive, according to people familiar with the discussions. This is coming from Jake Sullivan, talking about a broad southern offensive as an alternative. The Ukrainians accepted the advice and undertook a narrower campaign focused on Kherson City, which sits on the west side of the Dnieper River, separated from Russia-held territories by the east. I give the Ukrainians a lot of credit, the defense official said. They allowed reality to move them toward a more limited set of objectives in Kherson, and they were nimble enough to exploit an opportunity in the north. That's a lot. Kovalchuk set out to bisect. Now, he's the commander, Ukrainian forces. Kovalchuk, set out to bisect the Russian-occupied areas on the west side of the Dnieper and trap the Russian forces. My task was not only to liberate the territory, he said, my task from the start was to occlude and destroy the force. That is, to not let them leave or exist. And they put out this map here. We'll come back to the map in a second. But here these are the two bridges that were destroyed. We'll talk about in a second. And that's the hydroelectric dam. That's the location of the dam. And this, of course, is Crimea. Failing that, the goal was to force them to flee. The 25,000 Russian troops in that portion of Kherson, separated by the broad river from their supplies, had been placed in a highly exposed position. If enough military pressure was applied, Moscow would have no choice but to retreat, Kovalchuk said. Russia had to arm and feed its forces via three crossings, the Antonovsky Bridge, the Antonovsky Railway Bridge, and the Nova Kakhovka Dam, which is part of the hydroelectric facility with a road running on top of it. The two bridges were targeted with U.S.-supplied M142 high-mobility artillery rocket systems, or HIMARS, which have a range of about 50 miles and were quickly rendered impassable. Quote, there were moments when we turned off their supply lines completely and they still managed to build crossings, he said. They managed to replenish ammunition and it was difficult. Kovalchuk considered flooding the river. The Ukrainians, he said, even conducted a test strike with a HIMARS launcher on the floodgates at the Nova Kakhovka Dam, making 3 holes in the metal to see if the Dnieper's water could be raised enough to stymie the Russians crossing but not flood nearby villages. The test was a success, Kovalchuk said, but the step remained a last resort. So he held off. But they did punch holes in the dam and they did have a plan. Now they could have put in anywhere in here one of those AUVs or UUVs and drove it up here and planted fucking charges on the dam and then drove it back, set them off. Or it could have been HIMARS. I don't know. But they were desperate to cut off not only the water supply to the people of Crimea, but also access going back and forth to resupply the Russians in Kherson. Now they've apparently done it anyway. And correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't they retake Kherson? The Ukrainians? Or didn't the Russians leave Kherson of their own accord? I don't know. But I do know this. Of all parties involved, the only ones that we know of who have attacked that dam, who have poked holes in that dam, and who are on record saying it would serve our interests to take out that dam and flood the fucking river and make it impossible for the opposition to come across. The only ones who have done that so far demonstrated that effort, potential, and desire were, of course, the Ukrainians and not the Russians and not Putin, who have been defending that dam ever since this thing began. So for all of you out there who are still saying, oh, it's got to be Putin, why would fucking Zelensky take out his own fucking dam? Well, now you have it. And you heard it from the head of their fucking military forces via the Washington Post. Not from some conspiracy theorist or fucking Russian bot or Russian agency. That's from directly from the Washington Post and the head of the fucking offensive taking place down there on the side of the fucking Ukrainians. Yeah, they're the ones who fucking did it. No doubt, no question. Put that one to fucking bed. All done and over with that one. Again, hat tip to Uncle Hotep. If you're not following Uncle Hotep, I don't know why you aren't. Thank you for your time.